Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this Ag Forecast, brought to you by Agrible, the makers of Morning Farm Report. Our software gives growers the insights to make the best decisions possible about their operations. Well, as we've been discussing, the last 7 days really quiet across much of the United States in terms of precipitation or really any adverse weather. Really, if we just start on the East Coast, we really had a system that went through, near Thanksgiving that kind of brought some coastal precipitation into this area. We did have our system we discussed that went through parts of Florida and southern Georgia and parts of South Carolina around and on Thanksgiving. Midsection of the country, really quiet. In fact, several warm days in a row for this part of the country. And about the only place that's been really wet has been the West Coast. Multiple onshore flow events, basically a persistent trough kind of sitting here off the West Coast, bringing a lot of mountain snow and a lot of valley rain. And so very wet here, well over 200% of average precipitation over the last 14 days. And we're not quite yet done with the precipitation here, but we're going to be watching for a bit of a transition in the pattern, and that's really what I want to talk about. So let's get right into what we're looking at in terms of precipitation this week. So I'm going to show you a series of maps, and each one of these maps shows you precipitation accumulating over a 24-hour time period beginning at noon on one day and going to noon the next day. So here is the noon Sunday through noon Monday precipitation, so Monday the 27th here. We can really see the impacts of that stronger onshore flow along the West Coast, impacting, basically bringing in quite a bit of precipitation here. But wow, most of the country is relatively quiet. As we get into from noon on Monday through noon on Tuesday, we can see that that first system tries to push across the mountains, but really what's going on is the upper flow of the atmosphere here, where, the jet stream is really helping produce more weather systems that are kind of embedded in north central Canada than really anything else. In fact, we're going to be watching a low kind of going toward the Hudson Bay. It's going to try to drag this cold front down through this area, but look, most of the country spending Monday through Tuesday at noon relatively dry. By the time we get into Tuesday into Wednesday, we do see that system that's going through the Hudson Bay will try to drag a front that will come down into parts of the eastern Corn Belt, not bring in lots of precipitation, but maybe that's our first chance of it this week. There is also this little feature. This is interesting. A small piece of that trough that kind of came in along the West Coast will kind of work its way through the flow, creating a little bit of a shortwave trough, and that just creates lift out ahead of it that may bring some precipitation into parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri as we get into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday time frame. But what's interesting about all of this is really we got to get to, from basically Wednesday night into most of Thursday before we start to see our first real significant shot of precipitation for the central and eastern Corn Belt. And that's because we're going to watch a second low pressure system kind of move and go through the Hudson Bay area. And that's really what our main driver is to begin our week. You see, here's that flow pattern of the surface winds by the time we get into Thursday morning. And you can see the jet stream is really going to be hanging out pretty far to the north here. And as a consequence, the low pressure systems are going to form there. So here you are way up in the Hudson Bay. It's going to drag a cold front all the way down through the Great Lakes, getting back into northern Texas and Oklahoma area. So it will be the warm air out ahead of us that brings in some moisture that could give us some precipitation on Thursday of this week. But until then, relatively dry week unless you live along the West Coast, which is going to see some stronger onshore flow. But what we need to see here is if this whole flow pattern is going to change and when it's going to change and what that means for us. So let's dig right into that. Animating in the top here, it's kind of a new animation I'm going to make for you. So you just looked out for the next 16 days at what the overall flow of the atmosphere is going to be. So let's get back and talk about the big features here. Now at the bottom, these are the big things I want to talk about. We're going to see a pretty massive transition in the flow of the jet stream from the first week of December into the second week of December. And that transition is going to take us from some really warm air to some really cold air, and in between, potentially a pretty big storm system. So this is what I'm talking about. By the time we get into Monday, this is what I mean. See how the flow of the jet stream, there's a lot of troughs and ridges. Look, Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, north central Canada, getting over here toward kind of the southern tip of Greenland. We got 1, 2, 3, 4 shortwave troughs all lined up. But the main flow of the jet stream is pretty far north. In other words, none of these troughs are really digging really far to the south. And what we actually see here is that starting off our week, most of the Corn Belt would be seeing a pretty broad, ridge feature in through this area. And that's going to signal some warmer air returning, or staying put, I should say, in the central and eastern part of the country. So look at this. By the time we get into Tuesday, we see that there's that main trough that's going to be sitting here off near Hudson Bay. It's going to produce a low pressure center ahead of it. That's going to try to drag a cold front, getting down into parts of the Great Lakes into Illinois, but really not going to do too much in the way of that. I mentioned that little shortwave that was going to be going through parts of Oklahoma. There it is. That's a little guy right there that may produce some precipitation by the time we get into Wednesday into this area. But overall, this pattern is one that the middle part of the country and really getting over into the eastern part of the country, we'll be seeing some warmer conditions. And we just see this. This takes us all the way through, midweek of this week. Now, if you remember 10 days ago, I was worried about this trough because 10 days ago, this trough was forecast to be much deeper. It was going to kick a low pressure center off in the middle of in the middle of the Great Lakes. But because the jet stream has migrated more north and that warm air has really surged north, this is going to produce a feature that's going to be closer to the Hudson Bay area. It's going to drag a front through the eastern Corn Belt, which is really when our next significant chance of precipitation is going to be for a lot of the Corn Belt. But watch this. After that passes through, we still see those, higher heights, therefore warmer temperatures getting into our next weekend. We got to really get all the way into, let's call it the 4th, maybe even the 5th of December before everything starts to shift. And this is the big point to be on the lookout for. Notice the difference. We've been talking about for several weeks now the influence of that big ridge over the southwest. Well, look at the pattern breaking down. Maybe let's call it December 5th, 6th, 7th, sometime around that time period. We see a deep trough kind of plunging here into the western states, really in the Four Corners, while a big ridge builds out ahead of it. And what's going on here is that we're seeing one big ridge build up into the Gulf of Alaska, displacing a whole bunch of warm air this direction. We have a big ridge building into Greenland, which is going to displace a whole bunch of warm air to the north here. And as a consequence, that cold air that is in place over Canada has to go somewhere. It's going to get squeezed in between the two into a big trough that's going to initially plunge into the western U.S. Okay, so that's our first feature. But what I want you to see is that whenever we see something like this occurring, that's really important to see what that does in between the trough ridge pattern, because this may signal sometime, let's call it again the 5th, 6th, 7th, a pretty big low pressure system developing somewhere in the central United States that could be a pretty big winter storm. So we got to watch that. That's the transition I'm talking about here. But after that pattern shifts, look at this. By the time we get out in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, we see that the GFS is really trying to set up into a bit of a longer wave pattern where we see a broader trough over the eastern half of the country again. And if that does establish, what we could expect here is some pretty cold air moving across the Great Lakes, so potentially some lake effect snow. We'll have to be watching for multiple shortwave troughs coming around this, giving us a very, very active storm track for a lot of the eastern Corn Belt. While out west, if this is the pattern as it does set up mid-December, could signal, its return to near average or warmer than average temperatures. Now remember, the model's picking up on the overall flow pattern, so this will not nail it down perfectly, and we can expect to see a whole lot more kind of a smaller scale features that are not going to show up in this long range forecast. But if this is the overall flow pattern, this signals a pretty big transition from a warm start to December to a stormy and cool mid-December. And we'll have to just see how long that hangs on. Longer range ECMWF model agrees with this, and it also agrees that maybe we could see this hanging on through Christmas time. So we got to really be on the lookout for what this signifies. So let me kind of get you the breakdown here. What we're watching is the next 10 days in terms of temperature anomalies. And what you just saw is basically, as I step through most of the days getting up until, through this week. So here's Thursday, Friday, just kind of stepping through day by day here. Much of the country stays warm. It's really not until we get that pattern shift, which may come around again, 5th, 6th, 7th, that the cold air really starts to plunge in as that trough advances. So we've got several warm days in a row coming up for much of the Corn Belt. Doesn't mean every day is going to be warmer than average, but most of those days will be warm. Now, this is what's interesting. When that pattern shift does occur, we're going to be watching for this trough to dig in at some point. We don't know the exact timing of it, but at some point. And this is what you need to be on the lookout for. You see, when the jet stream digs into a deep trough like this, the atmosphere becomes favorable for the development of big low pressure systems as you go from a trough into a ridge. And it's this region right in through here where we see strong upper level support. We call it upper level divergence that really allows the air to rise and the pressure to fall in this particular area. If we combine that with the fact that we have a pretty strong jet streak in through here, winds in this area at about 150 knots, that produces very, very strong upper level forcing in this area, which is right now being forecast by the longer range models to be somewhere in the Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas area right in through here. And that's why the models are currently projecting at that same time period a deep low pressure system developing here, big time snows. This is a blizzard on the backside, heavy rain out ahead of it. But because that trough, the trajectory of the fast winds in that trough are really at this point not digging, but instead lifting, the whole system's trajectory will be toward the Great Lakes rather than digging into the Ohio River Valley at this point. Now, is this going to happen exactly as the models are projecting it right now? No, it's not. But at some point, as that trough digs in, it will kick off a big system like this. And that will signal some big snows for this part of the country, some heavy rain out ahead of it, and potentially some severe weather. Now, again, this is all kind of in the longer range, but I want you to at least know that when this transition does come through, expect this. And after it moves through, we're going to be seeing some cold weather, some normal kind of winter weather, I guess you could call it, for the eastern half of the country. So that's kind of your overall flow pattern getting you through mid-December. Now, let's take a quick look at South America. Animating here is the next 10 days of total accumulated precipitation. There is some strong model agreement between the GFS and the European model that this section in through here, so part of Mato Grosso getting into Goiás, getting over toward the eastern part of Brazil, is going to be seeing a very wet and active kind of weather pattern in through here. To the north of that, it's looking to be dry. To the south of that, it is looking to be dry. And so I know it looks like they're getting quite a bit of precipitation, but this is actually much drier than average. And so that was kind of, I'm telling you that kind of on piggybacking on what I explained in my last update, in that we are seeing some of the longer range models picking up on a drier northeastern part of Brazil and a drier southern Brazil and maybe even drier parts of Argentina as we get into December, January, and February. Right now, though, the rains are looking very favorable for both soybean and corn production. So we're going to have to wait to see how this evolves in the coming weeks. But right now, like I said, active South American convergence zone, active Brazilian monsoon. So I think I'll go ahead and stop there. And with that, I hope you look forward to our next video, which is coming out next Thursday. So to get Morning Farm Report for your operations, complete with a daily email that shows a snapshot of your field conditions, go to morningfarmreport.com. Sign up for a free account. Full grower accounts are free if you sign up for a sustainable yield program or for growers who work with ADM merchandisers. So until I talk to you next, look forward to a relatively warm week with maybe some precipitation coming in the Wednesday, Thursday time period. Look forward to talking to you again midweek.